My name is Ezra Dalton Whitlock, and I was born in Independence, Missouri, on the 14th of March, 1844. I'm 89 years old now, recording this in the summer of 1933, and I suppose I'm one of the last living riders of the Pony Express who can still tell you what it was really like. Not the storybook version, not the dime novel nonsense they printed back east. The truth. My father, Samuel Whitlock, was a blacksmith. My mother, Prudence, took in sewing and mending. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. Independence in those days, you have to understand, it wasn't like now. It was the jumping-off point for everything heading west. Oregon Trail, California Trail, Santa Fe Trail, they all started right there in our town. I grew up hearing wagon wheels creaking past our house at dawn, seeing families packed up with everything they owned, heading out to I don't know what. Some of them made it. A lot of them didn't. I was 16 years old in the spring of 1860 when a man named Gideon Ashford came through town recruiting riders for the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. That was the official name, but everybody just called it the Pony Express. Gil Ashford, he was maybe 30 years old then, lean as a whip, with eyes that looked like they'd seen the far side of everywhere. He'd been riding since the service started in April of that year, and he had a way of talking that made you want to follow him straight into hell if he asked. The advertisement said they wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. Well, I wasn't an orphan, but my parents knew better than to stand in the way of a 16-year-old boy who'd already made up his mind. My father shod Gil's horse for free, and my mother packed me a satchel with 2 shirts, an extra pair of socks, and a Bible I never did read much. She cried when I left. I didn't understand why then. I do now. Gil Ashford became my mentor, I suppose you'd call it. He taught me everything. How to mount a running horse. How to transfer the mochila, that's the mail pouch, from one saddle to another in under 2 minutes, sometimes under 1 minute if you were good. How to read the sky for weather coming in. How to know when your horse was about to give out before the horse knew it himself. How to sleep in the saddle for short stretches without falling off. How to survive on hardtack biscuits and jerky for days at a time. There was a woman in St. Joseph, Missouri, where one of the main stations was. Her name was Temperance Hayes, and she ran a boarding house where riders could get a hot meal and a real bed when we passed through. She treated us like we were her own sons, every single one of us. I think she knew, even if we didn't, how dangerous what we were doing really was. The whole country was tearing itself apart that year. South Carolina had seceded in December of 1860. More states followed. War was coming, everybody could feel it, and we were riding right through the middle of it all, carrying messages that might determine whether this nation would survive or split in two. I made my first run in late March of 1861, 75 miles, which was considered a standard route. I thought I was going to die before I finished it. Everything hurt. My legs, my back, my hands from gripping the reins. But I finished. Gil met me at the end station, grinned at me, and said something like, "Now you're a rider." Or maybe it was, "Now you know." I don't remember his exact words, but I remember that grin. I remember feeling like I'd just joined something important, something bigger than myself. I had no idea what was coming. The training under Gil Ashford was brutal, and I mean that in the most literal sense. He didn't coddle us, didn't make allowances for youth or inexperience. He'd wake us before dawn, sometimes in the middle of the night, and make us practice the changeover drill until our hands bled from the leather straps. 2 minutes to dismount, grab the mochila off one saddle, throw it onto the fresh horse, and mount up again. 2 minutes. He'd stand there with his pocket watch, and if you went over, you'd do it again, and again, and again until you got it right. I wasn't the only young rider at the station. There was a fellow from Kentucky named Leland Pruitt, though everybody called him Lee. He was my age, maybe a year older, and he had this competitive streak that drove both of us to be better. We'd race each other during practice runs, push each other harder than Gil even pushed us. It was friendly rivalry, the kind that makes you sharp. Lee had red hair and freckles across his nose, and he could ride like he'd been born on horseback. I envied that about him. Still do in a way. The superintendent of our division was a man named Augustus Renfield. Gus Renfield. He'd been in the Army before this, cavalry, I think, and he ran the Pony Express operation like a military campaign. Everything had to be precise, scheduled down to the minute. He was a hard man, didn't smile much, didn't waste words, but he was fair. If you did your job, he respected you. If you didn't, well, you wouldn't be riding for long. I was scared of him that first month. Most of us were. We had to memorize every station on our route. Not just the names, but the distances between them, the terrain, where the water was, where the danger spots were. There was a station master at Julesburg named Nathaniel Crowder, Nate to those of us who knew him. He was maybe 40 years old, grizzled, with a scar running down the left side of his face from some fight or accident he never talked about. Nate Crowder saved my life once, but that comes later in the story. My first real run, not a practice but an actual mail delivery, nearly killed me. It was supposed to be a routine 75-mile stretch, and I thought I was ready because I'd done it in training. But training and the real thing, they're not the same. Not even close. You're carrying weight that matters. You're riding horses you might not know well, and you're alone out there, completely alone, with nothing but the stars and the sound of hooves and your own thoughts. I remember finishing that run, and barely being able to stand when I dismounted. My legs wouldn't hold me. I sat down right there in the dirt outside the station, and I think I might have cried a little, though I wouldn't have admitted it then. Gil found me there about an hour later. He didn't say anything, just handed me a canteen of water and sat down next to me. After a while he said something like, "It gets easier," or maybe it was, "You'll get stronger." I wish I could remember exactly. What I do remember is that it didn't feel like a lie when he said it. By the summer of 1861, things were getting dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weather or exhausted horses. The Paiute tribes had started attacking stations. They had good reason to, I understand that now. We were cutting through their land, killing their game, bringing disease and disruption. But at the time, all I knew was that riders and station keepers were dying. There was a girl, Martha Jane Kellogg, daughter of one of the station masters out near Cottonwood Springs. She was maybe 15, 16 years old, sharp as a tack, and she'd grown up on the frontier so she knew things. She warned me once that she'd seen Paiute scouts watching the trail. I didn't take it as seriously as I should have. Young men never think anything bad is really going to happen to them. We think we're immortal. We're idiots. And then came April of 1861, and I stopped being an idiot real fast. It was the 12th of April, 1861. I remember the date because that was the day Fort Sumter was fired upon, though we didn't know it yet, out where we were. News traveled slower than you can imagine now. I was at Fort Kearny Station just finishing a regular run when Colonel Silas Pemberton came riding in hard with a cavalry escort. He was Army, regular Army, and he had that look officers get when something's gone terribly wrong, and they need to fix it immediately. He had dispatches, presidential dispatches, he said, that had to get through to California Command. Critical intelligence about troop movements, about the crisis back east, about things I didn't understand and wasn't supposed to understand. The problem was that Tobias Merriweather, the rider who was supposed to take the next leg, had been found half dead about 10 miles north of his station. Paiute attack, or maybe bandits, nobody was quite sure. Toby was a good rider, one of the best, and if they'd gotten him that badly, It meant the route was more dangerous than anyone had thought. Colonel Pemberton looked at me, looked at Gus Renfield, who'd come down from the division office, and said something direct like, "I need someone to ride double distance. 120 miles without a relief rider. Can it be done?" I remember Gus hesitating, which wasn't like him. He looked at me, and I was 17 years old, and I should have been smart enough to say no. But I wasn't smart. I was young and stupid and proud, and I said yes before I'd even thought it through. They gave me 15 minutes to prepare. I checked my gear 3 times, drank as much water as I could hold, ate some jerky even though my stomach was twisted up with nerves. Gil Ashford wasn't there that day. He was riding a different route, and I remember wishing he was because I wanted to ask him if I was making a mistake. But there was no time for that. Colonel Pemberton himself handed me the mochila, and it felt heavier than usual, though that might have just been in my head. He said, "Son, there are lives depending on this getting through. Ride like the devil himself is chasing you." I nodded, mounted up on a gray Mustang named Ulysses, and I rode. The first 30 miles were almost easy, if you can call any of it easy. It was night, maybe 10 o'clock, and there was a full moon that lit up the prairie like daylight. Cold, though. April nights, on the plains, they cut right through you. I could see my breath, could see Ulysses's breath steaming in the moonlight. The mochila bounced against my leg with every stride, and I kept thinking about what was inside it, about men's lives depending on words written on paper. It made everything feel heavy, consequential in a way my regular runs never had. I made the first changeover at Cottonwood Springs Station. The keeper there was a man named Jeremiah Alcott, Jerry to those who knew him. He was one of those fellows who didn't waste words, just did what needed doing. He had my fresh horse ready, a chestnut mare they called Ulysses. No, that's not right. The second horse was an Arabian stallion. No, wait, I'm getting confused. The second horse was a sorrel gelding named Tecumseh. That's right, Tecumseh. Jerry helped me with the changeover, and I saw him looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or doubt. He said, "You sure about this, Ezra?" And I said something like, "Too late to back out now," trying to sound braver than I felt. He nodded, didn't argue, and sent me on my way. The next 30 miles, that's when things started to feel wrong. Tecumseh was a good horse but temperamental, and he kept wanting to veer south when the trail went west. I had to fight him more than I should have needed to, and then I started seeing smoke signals on the horizon. Or I thought I did. It was hard to tell in the moonlight. Could have been clouds, could have been my imagination. But my gut told me something was off, and you learn to trust your gut out there or you don't survive long. Around the 50-mile mark, I passed a wagon train that had circled up for the night. There was a man standing watch, and as I rode past, he called out to me. I slowed down just enough to hear him. He was a preacher, I think, Reverend somebody, Blackwood maybe, and he said there'd been Indian signs all day, fresh tracks, and that I should be careful ahead. I thanked him and kept riding, but my heart was pounding harder than it had been, and it wasn't just from the exertion. 60 miles down, 60 more to go, and I was already more tired than I'd ever been in my life. I reached Mud Springs Station at the 60-mile mark just as dawn was starting to break. Gray light, that in-between time when the world looks flat and colorless, and your eyes play tricks on you because you're too tired to see straight. The regular station keeper, a man I'd met twice before whose name I can't recall now, he wasn't there. Instead, there was this young fellow, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20 years old, name of Horace Bridger. Everybody called him Hoke. He was a substitute keeper, filling in, and he was nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He had my fresh horse ready, but it was a horse I'd never ridden before, a pinto with wild eyes that kept dancing sideways when I tried to approach. Hoke said something like, "He's green, but he's fast," Just got him in yesterday. And I wanted to argue, wanted to demand a different horse, but I didn't have time. I transferred the mochila, mounted up on that pinto they called Geronimo, and I rode out with a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Geronimo was fast, Hoke had that part right, but he was also unpredictable. He'd shy at shadows, at prairie dog holes, at things I couldn't even see. I had to keep him under tight control every second, which meant my arms and hands were cramping worse than they already were. And that's when I started seeing riders behind me, or thinking I saw them. I'd look back over my shoulder and catch movement on the horizon, dark shapes that could have been horsemen, or could have been antelope, or could have been nothing at all. My mind was playing tricks. I knew that. But knowing something and believing it are two different things when you're 70 miles into a 120-mile ride, and everything hurts, and you haven't slept in over 24 hours. By mile 80, I was in bad shape. I won't lie about that. I reached Courthouse Rock Station, and the keeper there was an old man named Enoch Thaddeus Vale. He'd fought in the Mexican War, had stories that could keep you up all night if you let him get started. Enoch took one look at me and said, "Son, you need to stop. You're done." And maybe I should have listened. Maybe that would have been the smart thing. But I thought about Colonel Pemberton's words, about lives depending on those dispatches, and I thought about Gil Ashford and what he'd think of me if I quit, and I thought about Lee Pruitt and how he'd never let me hear the end of it if I gave up. Pride, you see. Stupid, stubborn pride. I told Enoch I was finishing this ride, and he didn't argue with me. He just shook his head, gave me my last horse, and said something like, "God go with you then." Or maybe it was, "You're braver than you are smart." I don't remember exactly. That last horse was a bay gelding named Sherman. Older horse, steady, with scars on his legs from hard years of work. Enoch said, "He knows the route. He's done it 100 times. If you start to black out, just give him his head and he'll get you there." I nodded, mounted Sherman, and rode out into what became the worst 40 miles of my entire life. A dust storm rolled in from the northwest, one of those spring storms that turns the air brown and stings your eyes and gets into your mouth and lungs, no matter how you try to cover your face. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. I lost the trail. I know I did because I ended up riding in circles for what must have been 30 or 40 minutes before I found it again. My water was gone. My hands were bleeding where the rains had rubbed them raw, and I started hallucinating. I saw my mother's face in the dust. I heard Gil Ashford's voice telling me to keep riding. I thought I saw Martha Jane Kellogg standing beside the trail, waving at me, which made no sense because she was 60 miles behind me. And then, I don't know, maybe around mile 100, I came over a rise and saw Chimney Rock Station down in the valley, and I thought, thank God, almost there. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The station was burned, just charred timbers and ash. Recent too, smoke still rising. No one there, no horses, no people. Evidence of an attack couldn't have been more than a day or two old. That's when the real fear hit me, the kind of fear that goes bone deep. Because I had 20 more miles to go and I had no backup, no place to stop, no help coming. Just me and Sherman and those dispatches that I would deliver or die trying. Sherman was stumbling by then. I could feel it in his gait, the way his legs weren't picking up quite right. He was giving me everything he had left, and I was asking him for more. I leaned forward, put my hand on his neck, and I talked to him. I don't remember what I said. Probably nonsense, but I talked to him like he was human, like he could understand me, and maybe on some level he did. We rode through pain together, that horse and me, through darkness that was both literal and in my head. I saw things that weren't there. I heard things that couldn't have been real. And then, sometime around dawn, I saw lights ahead. Scotts Bluff Station. The end of the line. I'd made it. We'd made it. I don't remember dismounting. I don't remember handing over the mochila. What I remember is a man's face. The station keeper, his name was Wallace Pritchard, and people called him Deacon because he was religious or something. I remember him looking at me like he'd seen a ghost, and I remember him saying, "Sweet Jesus, son, you rode from Fort Kearny?" And I remember nodding, and then everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in a cot at the Scotts Bluff station, and I thought I'd died and gone somewhere I didn't deserve to be. Every part of my body hurt in ways I didn't know were possible. My hands were wrapped in bandages. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. There was a woman there, I don't remember her name, maybe the station keeper's wife or his daughter, and she was spooning broth into my mouth and telling me to drink slowly. I tried to ask about the dispatches, about whether they'd gotten through, but my voice came out as a croak, and she just shushed me and told me to rest. Deacon Wallace Pritchard came in later that day, or maybe it was the next day. Time was strange during those 72 hours. He sat down beside my cot, and he told me that the dispatches had been forwarded immediately, that they'd reached California Command within the expected time frame, and that Colonel Pemberton had sent word back that what I'd done was, and I remember this phrase exactly, an act of extraordinary service to the Union. I didn't feel extraordinary. I felt like I'd been run over by a freight wagon. But I nodded and thanked him, and he patted my shoulder in this awkward way that told me he wasn't used to comforting young men who'd nearly killed themselves for the mail. Gus Renfield came to see me on the 4th day. I'd never seen him show much emotion about anything, but when he walked into that room and looked at me, something changed in his face. He didn't smile exactly, but his eyes softened, and he said, "Whitlock, what you did was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen a writer do, and I haven't decided which yet." Then he told me I was getting a week off, full pay, and that when I recovered I'd have my choice of routes. That was his way of saying he respected what I'd done, and coming from Gus Renfield, that meant something. Lee Pruitt rode 80 miles just to visit me. Can you imagine that? 80 miles out of his way when he should have been riding his regular route. He came in grinning like a fool, that red hair of his all messed up from the wind, and he said, "You crazy son of a gun, you actually did it." Joey, we talked for maybe an hour, and for once there wasn't any competition between us, just genuine friendship, and maybe a little awe on his part that I'd survived something he wasn't sure he could have survived himself. That meant more to me than any official commendation ever could. I found out later, much later, what those dispatches actually contained. Troop movement orders, intelligence about Confederate sympathizers in California, instructions that Colonel Pemberton said saved at least 200 lives when fighting broke out in earnest. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if my ride really mattered in the grand scheme of things, but I carried it with me anyway. The idea that maybe I'd done something that counted, something bigger than just a 17-year-old kid trying to prove himself. Gil Ashford died 6 months after my ride. Paiute attack near Ruby Valley Station. They found him and 2 other riders, and it wasn't quick, from what I heard. I didn't go to any kind of funeral because there wasn't one. They buried him out there on the prairie, and that was that. I think about him still. I think about the things he taught me, about how he made me better than I thought I could be. Toby Merriweather, the rider who'd been attacked before my run, he never fully recovered. He lived, but something in him was broken, and he never rode again. I saw him years later, and he was working as a clerk in a dry goods store, and we didn't talk about the Pony Express. Some memories are too heavy to share. Sherman, that bay gelding who carried me the last 40 miles, I bought him when the Pony Express shut down. Paid $35 I didn't really have, but I couldn't let him go to just anyone. He lived on my family's property until he died of old age in 1873. I buried him myself, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried doing it. That horse gave me everything he had when I needed it most. Martha Jane Kellogg married Nate Crowder, the station keeper from Julesburg, and they had 6 children. I heard she lived to be 87 years old. I hope she had a good life. The Pony Express ended in October of 1861, just 18 months after it started. The transcontinental telegraph made us obsolete overnight. All that risk, all that sacrifice, all those young men riding themselves and their horses into the ground, and it lasted less than 2 years. People forget that. They think of it as this grand romantic adventure that went on for decades. But it didn't. It was a brief, brilliant, desperate attempt to hold a fracturing nation together, and then it was gone. I worked as an Army scout during the war, rode dispatch for various military units, and after the war I tried my hand at farming, failed at that, worked on the railroad for a while, and eventually settled down in Nebraska where I still live today. I'm 89 years old now. My hands shake. My memory isn't what it used to be. But I remember that ride. I remember every mile of it. The fear, the exhaustion, the determination to finish what I'd started. I dream about it sometimes, even now. I hear the sound of hooves on hard ground. I smell the sage and the dust. I feel the weight of that mochila against my leg. The official records never mentioned my 120-mile ride. I don't think anyone believed a 17-year-old kid could do it, so they just didn't write it down. For years that bothered me. I wanted recognition, wanted people to know what I'd done. But I'm old enough now to understand that it doesn't matter. The men who rode with me, they knew. Gil Ashford knew wherever he is, and I know. I was there. I did it. And 72 years later, I'm still here to tell you about it. That has to be enough.